Hi, my name is Ann Silver. Unfortunately, I don't have a name sign. I was born and raised in Seattle, Washington. I grew up in a hearing family of 5 with one brother and one sister. I went to a public school, which was a mainstreamed environment without any professional access services like an interpreter or a note taker. Truly, in my hometown of Seattle, American Sign Language and fingerspelling were strictly forbidden. So I grew up as an oralist. I would say that my early education was 90% guesswork and about 10% art. There was a lot of reading, too, and a lot of speech therapy. My mom was my homeschool teacher for speech training, and I abhorred it. I truly suffered through it. She used a mail order speech training curriculum from John Tracy Clinic. It was that correspondence course. So, yes, I am a survivor. Art is in my family DNA. I was an artist before I was born. I like to say I was creating art on the wall of my mother's womb, like kids draw on the wall in crayon. I would do that after I was born too, not on the walls, but on the ceiling of my room in my house. I would climb up on boxes and create art on the ceiling, to my family's dismay. Almost like the Sistine Chapel, if you're familiar, Michelangelo and his famous work up on the ceiling. During the early 60s, I was living in Seattle, and we had a local organization called the Seattle Hearing and Speech Center. I would often go there for speech classes. It was a local organization quite near my home. One day, I entered the office of the executive director, took a seat, and noticed on the wall next to me a fairly large painting, a watercolor piece. And as I examined it further, I noticed that the painter was Morris Broderson. And that took me aback. I could not believe that this painting depicted fingerspelling. It was a quote by Thoreau. I was absolutely shocked. You have to understand that in Seattle at the time, fingerspelling and American Sign Language were strictly forbidden. I grew up during a pre-oralist time. I just could not believe the double standard that was depicted in this piece in the executive director's office. I thought to myself, what the hell? I was excited at the same time. I mean, fingerspelling was as scandalous as porn. It was truly a watershed moment in my art career. It gave me permission, and it gave me the freedom to do what I wanted in my art, to express deaf culture, American Sign Language, in my art. And so the next thing you know, I was beginning the next chapter of my life at Gallaudet. My work with Harry Williams, various galleries in DC, and this moment with Broderson in that office all formed a blueprint for the deaf art movement, abbreviated DAM. From a young age, I always had access to art education. That continued on to high school, and then once I got to Gallaudet, that continued. Although my first major was English, I later changed it to art after my exposure to deaf art during the deaf art movement. However, I wouldn't call myself a formally trained artist. Art, for me, was kind of a way out. There was no other major or coursework that seemed interesting to me at the time. But if deaf studies was offered, I certainly would have picked it. When I went to Gallaudet, my classmate, John Darcy Smith, he introduced me to Harry Williams. The two of them were from the same residential school for the deaf in California, and the three of us all had a strong interest in art, and from the moment I met Harry, we were fast friends. On weekends, we would go to local galleries and museums. He was my museum buddy. We would go together to all of these different openings. We would also help each other in other ways. I would often write English papers for him, and he would teach me American Sign Language. I didn't know American Sign Language until I got to Gallaudet. It was a whole new world for me. Harry also gave me exposure to deaf artists of the past. He had a vast knowledge of deaf art history, way before that type of information was published in books like Deaf Heritage by Jack Gannon. There just wasn't information like that published in one place. He was a cultural broker for me. When Harry and I visited various galleries, we were exposed to the front lines of artist movements by different communities: Black artists, feminist artists, artists from the gay and lesbian community. And upon seeing all of those different spaces, it was an aha moment for us. We knew we wanted to create such a space for the deaf community. Why didn't we have a deaf art movement? And so we were so excited. We went back to Gallaudet and spread the word to art majors, other students, friends from the deaf community. And we were met with varying levels of interest. Some folks really didn't understand what we were going for, but others were interested. There was about 7 or 8 of us who were truly passionate about this. And we started talking about what this movement might look like, what we wanted to express about deaf culture, and how we might express deaf culture through art. We thought we needed a philosophy, various elements and characteristics of what might be deaf art, and how might we go about showing the deaf experience through art in a way that our audience would be able to recognize. These were all important questions, and I remember Harry Williams mentioned the Broderson piece, thinking about fingerspelling and how that shows the deaf experience. And that helped everyone understand these were just the beginning moments of putting together the deaf art movement. Now I had the idea to bring this into the classroom, to have instruction under Betty G. Miller. My classmates and I were excited to show our professor our latest artworks about the deaf experience, and when we showed them to her, she was absolutely shocked. She put a stop to it right away. That sentiment was echoed by the art department chairperson, who I believe was Angelo Corte. He was not deaf. He put a stop to this as well. He thought it was inappropriate for the classroom, that we needed to receive more classical training, to follow traditional methods of learning from the masters. We would have nude models come every week for figure drawing, and he wanted us to focus on that type of instruction. And that was fine, but we all had a growing sense of unease with this. And often over meals, we would sit and talk about what we were going to do. We didn't want to stop creating art about the deaf experience. And so we found a solution. We continued to make art about the deaf experience in our dorm rooms. We also created art in a separate building outside of the art department. Now, the art department had various supplies, and some students would take those supplies and bring them elsewhere so that we could create art in a different space. I was taking an independent study course at the time under Betty G. Miller, and it was focusing on 8mm film. I chose to use that assignment to focus on various deaf artists and their work during this time. I filmed Harry Williams creating his A to Z series, and there were other deaf students that I filmed as well. I wanted to capture what deaf art looked like and the process of making it. And I ended up making a film about these students' work and their anger at the art department. I received inspiration, support, and advice from a local organization called Deaf Pride. This organization was a group of activists. I wouldn't call them artivists, but they were very active on the political and educational scene long before Deaf President Now, before everything else, really. This was a great group for me to get involved with at the start. Before graduation, Betty asked me to design a postcard announcement for her one-woman show. And I agreed, but I wanted a little more information about the event. She told me it would be about her life as a deaf artist. With that, I created a design that she accepted. The postcard was submitted for publication and it was sent out. This was ahead of her show in February of 1972. And I remember it was open to the public, everyone was there. Even the newspaper reporters were there, TV station. Now, my classmates and I were absolutely shocked to see the pieces that she was exhibiting. She had said no to us so many times to create art about the deaf experience, and here she was showing her work about this very subject. This created a lot of dissonance for me. At the same time, I was feeling happy because she really did get deaf art off the ground, and that's important. Looking back on this time, I'm finally able to recognize that I'm glad that it happened. It got deaf art up and running sooner rather than later. Just a day before graduation from Gallaudet, they offered me a position that I hadn't applied for, and it was to design a children's book. This was for Gallaudet's Signed English project. And at that time, I didn't understand the difference between signed English, not signed exact English, but just signed English and American Sign Language. I used simultaneous communication that I had learned at Gallaudet. But I thought, at least this position has art involved in it. But it created such controversy. The philosophy of signed English was contentious. Fred Schreiber at the time was the executive director of National Association of the Deaf, NAD. He thought that American Sign Language books should be a priority, and this caused quite the contentious discussion between NAD and Gallaudet, their psychology department, which was in charge of creating the children's book. Now, my supervisor at the time was Dr. Barbara Knappel. And I remember her telling me that she was just so upset about the whole thing, that she wasn't comfortable creating content with signed English because American Sign Language was our natural language. And this was a pivotal moment for me. It was truly a turning point. I felt that I was at a moral crossroads. She decided to quit, and she encouraged me to quit as well. And so the next thing you know, I had quit. There were 4 of us on the project, including Ralph Miller. Now, Ralph Miller was Betty G. Miller's father, and he worked with us for several years. He agreed with us, but he felt like he needed to stay on the project. He would often share his artwork about the deaf experience with me. I thought it was wonderful. He was truly part of our community, but he didn't create art about the deaf experience through Gallaudet. It was only his personal work, but it was powerful. I think he had a strong influence on Betty as well. So after I quit, I moved to New York City. Liz Baird, who was Chuck Baird's older sister, we were good friends, and she was also a part of the deaf art movement. Now, she wasn't in the same class as I was. I was class of 72. I believe she was a year ahead, but we were in the same art class. It was full of students in various years of their programs. But we decided to drive to New York City. But after a while, she decided she didn't want to live in the city, and so she ended up moving back to DC. I was able to find a few opportunities for work, but I just became frustrated because every time they would find out I was deaf, I was rejected. I remember a few different episodes of this. One art director saw my portfolio and was impressed with it, but told me I would not succeed in the world of publishing because I was a deaf person. I couldn't believe he said that. Another art director, who was also impressed with my work, told me that I wouldn't succeed simply because I was deaf. And I found out he's the father of 2 deaf girls. There was another publisher, I remember, who was looking through my portfolio, and when I mentioned I was deaf, he couldn't believe it. He closed my portfolio and sent me out of the room right away. And I found out later on that his wife was the principal of a residential school for the deaf. I believe it was Lexington. Another art director who was impressed with my work, and when I told them I had no experience with this particular job, I had never created designs for a book cover, but I was more than willing to try. I asked for the chance. And he gave it to me. He asked for 3 examples for a design for a book cover by the next morning, and I spent all night working on it. The next morning, I presented him 25 different options for the book cover. He was impressed, and he offered me a job on the spot. From then on, I worked for that company for quite a long time until I was able to become an art director at another company. From all my work in book design, I became quite the master at hand lettering, as I would hand letter all of the book titles. I'm thinking of one example, Gone with the Wind, where the type sort of disappeared into the distance. And I would make these design covers for all sorts of genres, science fiction to westerns to romance, and they all were distinct and creative in their own way. This naturally led into logo design. Because you see, I'm a bit of a typeface and font snob. I want everything to be absolutely perfect, and everything was done by hand. At that time, I was not using a computer. I remember seeing the work of an artist, Milton Glaser. He was very well known as an art director and as a graphic artist, and I would certainly call him a pioneer in merging font and art into a new medium. Illustration and type design coming together to make something new altogether. And his work was displayed in galleries. And I thought, why not? Graphic design at the time wasn't considered a fine art, if you will. But this was monumental. It really influenced my work. I also remember seeing Robert Indiana and a few other pop artists doing similar things. Around that same time, I was very involved in my local art scene. And I happened to find out that the Andy Warhol lived in my neighborhood. We would go to the same parties, the same events. We shared similar interests. We both enjoyed photography, pop art, of course, and celebrities. You know, it's funny. I grew up with an exposure to pop art well before I moved to DC or to New York City. In the 50s and 60s, I was seeing all sorts of examples of this without knowing that it was pop art. It's also interesting, Andy Warhol was doing the same thing I was doing. We both were creating exact copies of the Mona Lisa. I was using pencil and paper, and I believe that was 1963. But anyways, I grew up just fascinated with the art on my cereal boxes. I loved looking at advertisements, billboards, any sort of consumer advertising using art and design and consumerism. Food packaging, also, anything that had a pop feel. Around that same year, the Museum of Modern Art contacted me about a position as an outreach coordinator. Guy Wonder and I took the job to connect with the deaf community. We did various outreach through deaf clubs, the silent news, different channels to encourage the community to go to museums. Museums weren't just for hearing people. It's truly a visual experience. And it needed to be made as accessible as possible. One way to do that would be to have a deaf docent. They were very pro-deaf, very proactive in that effort. There was also quite a large interpreter population in that area who helped support the 35 museums in the New York City area. I was one of the docents for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. My specialty was Chinese art. I got involved in artivism with that group in New York City at the beginning of my time there, and I would certainly call that artivism, but at the time I didn't have vocabulary for it. I called myself an activist. And I did that work through art, and so having that term made it easier to describe my work. The second wave of artivism for me was trying to prove that deaf art was a thing. Many people were resistant to the idea of deaf art. This was a battle that I fought over many years. I remember I made a pin that said the words, "Yes, Virginia, there is deaf art." I applied and was accepted to New York University for my master's degree. And if you can believe it, my major was vocational rehabilitation. Far off from my art career, but it was truly the closest thing I could get to deaf studies. It was my best excuse to be around deaf people. At the same time, I was offered a position doing book illustration by Martin Sternberg. He's the author of the ASL Dictionary. It's quite a hefty book. The original illustrator quit halfway through the project, and so he was in immediate need of help. So I decided to help him out and join the project, but was also studying full-time for my master's degree. Just before graduation in 1977, an organization called the International Theater Institute reached out to me, and they're based in New York City. They wanted to know more about deaf artists in other countries who were creating deaf art. I invited the executive director of the International Theater Institute to meet other deaf artists in the community, other international deaf artists, and they were interested in hosting a seminar in Sweden because Sweden is where the ITI conference was to be held that year. So I helped set that up. Dot Miles, Richard Kendall, Joseph Castronovo, and myself all attended. There were 35 deaf artists and performers from, I believe, 13 different countries who attended. We all spent a week talking about deaf sensibility. We hadn't quite nailed down the concept at the time. This idea wasn't just limited to art, but it included theater. An example might be the essence of deaf theater. What made deaf theater deaf theater? I remember Dot Miles presented about that. I was interested in visual art and how to connect deaf culture to visual art. And this was a groundbreaking moment for our community. Many of us didn't know this was possible before this time. It was a mind-blowing experience for all of us. And we decided we all needed to go back to our home countries and spread the word about this idea of deaf art. We agreed on 2 action items. The first was to set up an international organization, and we were running out of time, so we couldn't think of a name, and we decided just to put OOO as a placeholder. But it stuck. That was the name of our organization from that point forward. We also wanted to develop a statement about deaf art, the philosophy of showing the deaf experience through visual and performative arts. We gave this statement to ITI, and their Congress passed it unanimously. They were behind us 100%, and they were willing to give us support. They handed that statement over to UNESCO in Paris, And at that point, our funding was approved, because once the International Theater Institute had approved our request, then it was all paperwork from there. Then we turned everything over to Joseph Castronovo. He took care of all the paperwork for us and sorted out all the funding. He took on that responsibility, and he became a key player for all of this to happen. The few of us, Chuck Baird, Paul Johnston, Betty G. Miller, I wish I had a list in front of me. My memory is not like it used to be. We all fought to keep deaf art alive. And we made so much progress, starting with the student-based deaf art movement, all the way through to Devia. But everything took a major downturn with the AIDS epidemic. AIDS killed almost, if not all, of our artists. All of our creative minds were hit by this crisis. What kept our work alive through this difficult time were deaf artist panels. We would host discussions. We also held workshops. We did a lot of exhibiting in various places. We also wrote and published through newsletters, articles, but it was not easy. We didn't have technology at the time. It was so hard to mail out everything. The fax machine helped later on. It was a lot of communicating through TTY. It was hard. One major discussion was around deaf theater. We did have deaf theater on a national scale with National Theater of the Deaf, NTD, but we needed to have something local, something in the city. Around the same time, I was working for the Museum of Modern Art, really as a volunteer. And the director of the educational department was someone I reached out to about having a deaf art exhibit. Now, the Museum of Modern Art has special exhibits every year where they focus on a specific community, and this year they had focused on Black art. So I thought deaf art might be a possibility, and so I reached out to the administration and was met with resistance. They told us that they weren't ready for that type of an exhibit and that deaf art wasn't marketable, that it was too niche, and I think in other words, they didn't want to highlight disability. But the whole premise of these special exhibits were to highlight the diversity of the human race. So I was disappointed about that. The next year, they had a feminist art exhibit, and I posed the same question. I asked for an exhibit of deaf art and was met with the same resistance. During those years, in the midst of the 70s, was a big time for action, for activism. I didn't do much deaf art during that time. I was doing deaf-based logo design, but working on book cover designs and serving as an art director kept me plenty busy. I had little time for my own deaf art. I was so busy during those years, it was overwhelming. In 1991, I needed to leave New York City. I was breaking up with my partner at the time, and I moved back to Seattle. That year was a pivotal moment for me as an artist. I was truly able to explore deaf art in all the ways that I had wanted to years prior. Over the years, I had collected entire filing cabinets of notes on different art ideas. It was too much for me to do. I would need a team of artists to create work from all of those notes. When I was in New York, I was in a bad relationship. My partner didn't appreciate deaf art, and it was truly an autist relationship. Oh, I almost forgot to mention. At the time, I saw there was a National Endowment of the Arts competition for a grant. I decided to apply. It was a grant for design work, so I decided to put together an application of sign language design. I created a series of 10 deaf Japanese paintings. It was part of the requirement to have a series for the grant. They picked 3 finalists out of 20,000 applicants. They couldn't decide on a final winner, and so they decided to place each of the finalists with a specific organization. The organization I was placed with involved a residency in Japan, which I accepted right away. The work that I did then, I would call part of the early part of the second wave of the deaf art movement for me. The first wave would certainly be the student-based work at the very beginning in Gallaudet, but this was part of the second wave for me. After 1991, I created over 100 different pieces. Most of that work were road signs. I created a lot of work that I would call gallery pieces. Even though I wasn't featured in a gallery quite yet, I knew I was destined for that type of work. After my experience seeing Milton Glazer's work in an exhibition, I knew that I could do the same, and I thank him for that moment. In the spring, Betty G. Miller contacted me. She wanted my thoughts on a proposal that she was planning to work on. Betty G. Miller and Paul Johnston were planning to be co-presenters at the first Deaf Way conference. She wanted my feedback and to discuss the content of her presentation well ahead of the workshop. This was about a year ahead of time. Because she lived in DC and I lived in New York, we relied on TTY to communicate. Now, she didn't have a fax machine at home. I remember Betty needed to use Nancy Crichton's work fax to be able to send information back and forth. She would share her drafts and we would talk about the content of the workshop. Right before the workshop, I got very sick. The doctor ordered me to stay home, and I was devastated. I thought I wouldn't make it to the workshop. Betty, though, told me that I would be with them in spirit and that I would be called one of the originators. And I thought, okay, I had to sort of accept it. And during the workshop, we were able to communicate. We would fax back and forth. During her presentation with Paul Johnston, it was later on in the week of Deaf Way, and so I happened to be able to go as a reporter for the Silent News. I was there to cover the presentation, and I was surprised that my name was absent from the list of originators of the movement. I thought maybe they just overlooked it, or they got busy and forgot. I didn't bring it up. But I was shocked that she called the movement Devia. That's one thing I've always struggled with. Maybe it's because I'm a bit of an English snob, but I just felt it wasn't compatible with international English. What happened to the title Deaf Art? I thought it should be Deaf Art/Devia, to keep it bilingual, both ASL and English. But anyways, that was an important moment for Devia. The second wave of artivism for me was my focus on deaf women artists. I was processing and going through quite a lot of feelings about deaf women artists and deaf gay artists, thinking about all the issues that they face. The museum and gallery world is strongly male dominated, and I kept wondering, where were the female artists? I remember posing that exact question to Deborah Sonnenstrahl during an art history class in the 70s. And I remember she couldn't answer. She was so used to teaching the canon of male deaf artists. From Estrella on, all of the names that she highlighted were all deaf male artists. And I thought, how could that be? I remember making eye contact with Harry Williams and saying, well, what's wrong with deaf women artists? And he just pointed at me and said, case in point. I got a laugh out of that. But I could see that Deborah Sonnenstrahl realized that this needed to change. Now, it didn't change immediately. This change came several years down the road. We had exhibits of deaf artists, but they featured only men, unfortunately. I made a piece expressly for the National Women's Art Conference. That happened to be in Seattle. They had a conference and an art exhibition at the same time. I made a piece that said, "Why no deaf women artists?" right on it, to highlight the fact that deaf women artists face double discrimination. They suffer the experience of sexism and autism. I think it was in 1993 in Chicago. There was a Deaf Studies conference, and it was a revolutionary moment. Finally, we were displaying the art made by deaf women. It was Betty G. Miller, Chuck Baird, and myself who put together this exhibit in a hotel room. And I'll never forget, there were two hearing women who came into the show and were so upset by two pieces of art that I made that they ripped them off the wall. I remember running over to see what was going on. They had removed those two pieces from the wall because they were upset. I remember I was talking with the coordinator of the art exhibit, and the two of us, once we saw what was going on, ran over to tell them they should not be touching the artwork. I told them they were practicing censorship by removing these pieces. I was so upset. I wanted them to put them back. The coordinator, Jackie Mann, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her. She's from Gallaudet. She ordered hotel security to throw them both out. At that point, I didn't think I wanted to work as an artist. I was ready to quit. In 1995, Seattle, Washington hosted the National Conference for Deaf Women United. We were the first to have an exhibit that highlighted deaf women's art. It took some work to convince them, but it was important, and they were on board. It was such an incredibly large show. I wish we had video of the event. I don't have any pictures either. I was so busy running the event. Our next effort was to push the National Deaf Studies Conference to add art shows to their events. We wanted to keep deaf art alive as much as possible. My first influence was my family. My brother in particular influenced me to become an artist because he's an artist himself. It was Harry Williams who convinced me to become a deaf art artist. He told me I could succeed and make a living creating deaf art. I wasn't quite so sure at the time. He was such a tough marketer. He would go out and convince hearing folks to buy his work. And I thought if he could do it, so could I. This piece is entitled Deaf Identity Crayons, Then and Now. On the left, you can see the vintage box of crayons, and that represents 1889. On the right, you see Deaf Identity Crayons, 1999. This is the newer, more modern box. And you can see the differences between the two, both the labels and the terminology. On the left, you see negative and outdated terms. And then on the right, after a 100-year shift, more positive labels and terminology. On the left, these terms were coined by hearing people, and we can't be angry at the hearing world for that. It's their view of deaf people. That's what's represented here. Dummy, lip reader, deaf and dumb, hearing impaired, although that came a little later. Handicapped, oralist, deaf mute, and freak. On the right, we see the new, more modern terms. Coda is the first crayon. And I put the deaf crayon all the way to the right. I wanted it to signify this long journey that we've gone on to get to this label. Now, there's two crayons that folks are always curious about. They always want more of an explanation about coda and seeing. Coda represents child of a deaf adult, a child with deaf parents. These are hearing children of deaf parents. I put this in the box because I feel deaf identity includes codas, and it's up to them whether or not they want to claim that identity, but they've grown up in a deaf environment and they should be recognized for that. I didn't grow up as a signer. I didn't have that opportunity, and codas have had that opportunity. The other crayon that folks want to know more about is the one called Seeing. John Darcy Smith, who was one of the key players in the deaf art movement, he's the one who introduced me to Harry Williams. He was more of a thinker than an artist. He was truly a photographer. He had a one-person campaign to fight to change the labels for the deaf community. He thought since hearing folks are regarded as hearing, their ability to hear is what's being referenced. Therefore, why don't we call deaf people seeing? That's much better than hearing impaired. That suggests something is wrong, it's pejorative. Why not reference these two communities as hearing and seeing? And so he tried to convince the community and failed. It wasn't easy work, and that idea died with him. I do have to admit, this is my favorite piece of all the ones represented here. This piece is called Freedom to Speak Out in ASL. This piece was originally created as envelope art. It was created on a normal letter-sized envelope, oriented vertically, decorated with real stamps, and the lower portion of the envelope had the name and address of a friend of mine. I actually did mail it to them. Now, this was part of the mail art movement, and that was during the 1940s, 1930s era. And this movement was started by a man named Ray Johnson. He was certainly one of my early influences. The idea was to create art on envelopes and mail them to folks. He started this idea, and many other artists followed. The reason I cut off the lower portion of the envelope was just to protect the privacy of the friend that I mailed this to. I also enlarged the piece, as you can see here. Now, mail art was, in essence, a traveling art show for U.S. postal workers. As they delivered the mail, they could see the art and appreciate it. Mail art was the equivalent of social media 40 years before Facebook was invented. Typically, I would create art on a normal letter-sized envelope, and I would use only one stamp and create art that expanded on whatever image was represented in the stamp. I would always expand upon it and connect it to a theme in deaf art. I mailed various pieces out to family members and relatives and friends when I was in college. I think I did about 1,000 different envelopes. Now, what's interesting was that for my book, I wanted to find all of those pieces and publish them. But when I went to connect with those who I'd sent them to, not everyone had saved them. My mother, of course, saved everything. But by the time I was able to get to her archive, time had taken its toll and a lot of damage had been done. I was able to find several of them for the book. This piece is another one of my favorites. I decided to use car license plates as a medium to share my message. Instead of relying on road signs and food packaging, which was my norm, I decided to shift towards license plates as another way to convey my message. The title of this piece is A Century of Difference. This covers 100 years, from start to finish, with about 20 years, give or take. I have artistic license, of course. We start with deaf and dumb, deaf-mute, handicapped, hearing impaired, disabled, and deaf. Oh, I wanted to mention, one of the most important elements of my artistic expression is to examine themes and motifs. issues in the deaf community. And that's much more of a focus for me than worrying about specific colors, shapes, motifs, perhaps the enlargement of the ear or the hands. I was much more interested in the social and political message, like the difference between the deaf and hearing communities, oppression, mislabeling of the deaf community, using graphic wit in a deaf form, cultural identity, ASL and English duality. That all connects to how my art is so important to me and why I made all of these pieces. This piece is to call out the hearing community, to say, stop labeling us without our consent. The hearing majority acts as an authority and makes decisions about how we live our lives, our education, our employment. Labels make a big difference. Leave the labels to food cans. Unfortunately, today, negative labels still exist in literature, in media, and TV. As I explained a moment ago, it's not how I create art, but why that's important to me. However, I do want to give you just one example of the process, how I make the artwork, just to give you an idea of my artistic process over my career. You can see here there are lots of different notes and iterations of pieces, and I save all of those notes. I mentioned I took a lot of different ideas that I hadn't created art about quite yet and made record of those ideas that I saved in multiple filing cabinets. I also saved the notes from the art that I had created, and I would save these notes as important documents. I am a bit of a hoarder, I have to admit. I save so much, some of it junk, especially paper. Anyways, let me just give you a few examples. This is my two-dimensional paper collage work. It has many different layers, and I'll describe how the process works. I originally made 5 copies of each piece, and I mistakenly called them limited editions. And really, that's not what they should be called. Each of them is an original in its own right, and I learned that later on. I had labeled them 1 of 5, 2 of 5, and I really shouldn't have. But that was a mistake that I learned from. My original vision for this piece was to play on the idea of Gerber baby food and baby signs. As you know, it's popular now to teach hearing babies signs. So I made this in 2011 for the National Conference of the American Sign Language Teachers Association. That was hosted in Seattle, Washington, in my hometown. Just to give you an idea about the process and what it looked like, I had to buy the actual Gerber baby food from the store because I needed the label. From there, I drew up what I thought the final piece might look like. After I had sketched out the outline, I went to the store to Xerox it, to blow it up and make it larger. This was a tedious process, and you can see each of these pieces is separate. Each letter I had to orient just right to fit the layout I was looking for. The letters for baby were created using a letterpress technique to get them just the right size. Gerber I drew by hand, meticulously. And the image here is the enlarged version of the iconic baby picture on the labels of Gerber baby food. I tried to get the dimensions just right to fit a 16 by 20 frame, but I couldn't make it any larger. This is an example of a color study I did. I couldn't decide on exactly which colors to choose. I decided to make a painting, and these were the final colors that I chose. I referenced the color Bible book I have. It had examples using 2 colors, 3 colors, all sorts of options. My copy is in Japanese. It's a wonderful book. I reference it often. You can see here I used multiple colors, and from there I created this larger painting. This was done entirely in acrylic. With exception of the photo. Here you can see the letters D and H in a circle, kind of like the copyright symbol. D stands for deaf and H for hearing, because hearing babies learn sign too. Oh, I'm sorry, this piece is upside down. It should be oriented the other way, with the blue on the bottom. I created this piece outside. I set up 20 different canvases. And they weren't copies, but additions. Well, I suppose not additions, but originals, whatever you might call them. I used spray paint, and of course you need a mask for that. And the fumes were too strong to do it in the house. Also, just to mention, I rent a house. I'm an artist of humble means, a starving artist, if you will. Now, this was all contingent on the weather, and it would rain often. One day it was a bit windy, and one of my pieces went flying, and it landed in a bunch of leaves, paint side down. This was very frustrating work for me. I don't have an art studio in my home. It's just a small apartment. But anyways, all 20 didn't turn out the same. I started with the blue, and then added some beige, and finished with a bit of white until I was satisfied with it. But that's the story of this piece, which is upside down, but you get the idea. Now this is connected to this other piece. The first piece I carried to the store, and they had a color copy machine, but I realized it was too small. I couldn't fit my painting on it effectively, so I had to do it in segments. I had to scan each piece as I went. So I had 3 separate pieces that I copied and then cut out, and from there I could fit them together into the larger piece. Now I would do this outside using super glue spray, and it was such a delicate process. One mistake, even a small one in aligning the pieces, was permanent, and if you messed up, you had to start the process all over again. Ugh, it was hell work. Again, all contingent on the weather. From there, I mounted the larger piece onto white cardstock. That formed an outline. And then I glued it to this blue and white background you see here. So I did 5 originals of everything. Later, I made more because I got quite a bit of pressure from folks who were disappointed at first that the 5 had sold out. So then I made 10, but later on during the Deaf Way conference, I decided to make a total of 20, and they all sold out so fast. I decided I couldn't make 20 more after that. It was just too much work, and awful work. It was hard on my hands, it was time consuming. I stopped doing this process in 2011 after I met Jim Van Manen. He helped me set up the Silver Moon brand, and from that point forward, we made prints digitally. All right, I have 3 important pieces of advice. The first is to have a heart for American Sign Language, deaf culture, and deaf history. Second, have a mind for American Sign Language and deaf studies. And third, have an eye for deaf art and Devia.